Good morning, everyone. As Director of the Netherlands House of Education and Research, I wish to welcome you warmly to our seminar. This seminar that we're organizing together with the student unions, ISO and LSUB, and I want to warmly welcome particularly all the speakers that are joining us today. Inclusive education and inclusiveness of student mobility is a topic Nether and its members value highly. An education system of high quality is a system that offers effective equal opportunities to every student. Nether and its member organizations take the firm position that underrepresented groups of students should be better included in options for learning mobility. And this would include both credit mobility and full degree mobility, thereby making learning mobility or internationalization opportunities self-evident to all. The theme of inclusiveness is also one of the main priorities for the realization of the European education area by 2025, and for the new Erasmus program that was officially launched only last week. The Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union has made strong efforts for inclusive access to education and training, and also made it one of the main priorities for the presidency. We are therefore honored to have the Portuguese chair of the Education Committee of the European Council of Ministers as a keynote speaker for today. Very warm welcome to you, Janine. Now we see that both the definitions and the needs for inclusive education are different within the EU member states. And next to this, also the support needed by individual students can differ strongly. This webinar today aims at bringing us closer to a common understanding of inclusion in the European education area and provide inspiration for the education sector in tackling remaining obstacles. My colleague Marike will now briefly walk you through the program of today. Marike.
Yes, thank you, Jurgen, for the introduction. And good morning, and thank you to everyone joining us today. During the first half of the webinar today, we are very honored to host two speakers who will tell us more about inclusiveness of student mobility in Europe. First, we will have Janine Costa, the current chair of the Education Committee under the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. And afterward, a presentation by Vicky Reichling, Equality Coordinator from the European Students' Union. For the second half of this webinar, I will hand over to our guest, Matteo Vespa, Executive Committee member of the European Students' Union, who will lead the panel conversation with Christelle Coe-Ahmed from the National Agency for Erasmus Plus of France, Kambai Kau from the Amsterdam University of the Arts, and Abigail Chai from the University of Amsterdam. Unfortunately, the fourth panel member we had planned for today couldn't join us because of illness, but nonetheless, we will have a very interesting panel conversation for the second half of this webinar. Before we begin, I would like to note that if you may have extra questions for our panel members, please type them in the chat, and we will do our best to address them towards the end of the panel conversation. And then for now, I would like to hand over to our keynote speaker, Janine Costa, who will elaborate on the European efforts of the presidency the past months on inclusion in education and student mobility in particular. Janine, the floor is yours.
Firstly, many thanks. I wish to thank the NEDER, the National Student Unions of the Netherlands ISO, and LSVB for inviting me to be here via my screen in this online event on inclusive student mobility in Europe, and that in the last week of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this webinar dedicated to topics which are so relevant for the European Union, for the European project, for member states, for citizens, and for learners: inclusion and mobility. I will frame my intervention in 3 moments. The first one on the European framework for education and training for the next decade, the second one on inclusion, and the last one on mobility, in particular learning mobility. But please allow me now to go back to a few years ago, to 2017, to the Gothenburg Social Summit, and when education and training was singled out in the European Council conclusions of 14 December as a key to building inclusive and cohesive societies and to sustaining European competitiveness. Then, and from 2018 onwards, the Commission, together with member states, set out in motion actions to achieve this vision for the future of education and training through the establishment of a European education area, reinforced last year by the Commission's communication on achieving the EAA by 2025. The European education area, which we aim to achieve by 2025, is meant to create and to be a space where all citizens can freely circulate, to live, to learn, to do research, and to work. And for this, equity in access and inclusion in education and training for all, and in particular among underrepresented groups, is of utmost importance. And of course, learning mobility represents a valuable advantage, as well a learning opportunity which will be promoted with and within the European education area, but unfortunately is not yet equally accessible to all. So many more efforts need to be done in this context. Under the Portuguese presidency, last February, the Council adopted a resolution on a strategic framework for European cooperation in education and training towards the European education area and beyond 2021-2030. And not only is this resolution a reply to the Commission communication regarding the achievement of the EAA by 2025, the ambitious vision for the future of education and training in the EU, but it also sets out the strategic framework for European cooperation in the fields of education and training for the next decade. The new strategic framework will be an essential instrument to guide and support the European cooperation in education and training for that time. It establishes 5 strategic priorities for the strategic framework, the first one of which is related to the improvement of quality, equity, inclusion, and success for all in education and training, and the second of which is dedicated to making lifelong learning and mobility a reality for all. The framework includes also concrete issues and actions for all 5 priorities, as well as 7 indicative EU-level targets to be reached. I wish to highlight for food for thought some key elements of the Council resolution related directly to the topic of this webinar. First, mobility for learners, teachers, teacher trainers, and staff should continue to be expanded as a key element of EU cooperation and a tool to enhance quality and inclusion in education and training. Concrete actions are needed in order to promote the freedom for learners and educators to be mobile and for institutions to freely associate with one another in Europe and beyond through learning mobility and cooperation across borders. Secondly, further efforts must be made to remove existing obstacles and barriers to all types of learning and teaching mobility, including issues related to access, guidance, student services, and recognition. Third, And moreover, to reinforce cooperation between education and training institutions and foster mobility, there is still work to be done in areas such as the automatic mutual recognition of qualifications and study periods abroad and quality assurance. Finally, continued efforts are needed to make use of European initiatives to facilitate mobility, including those funded under Erasmus+. Furthermore, there is a need to update the learning mobility framework, which accompanies the new Erasmus Plus program in order to enable mobility opportunities for a much wider variety of participants and also foster green and digital mobility by promoting blending online and physical exchanges and to encourage balanced mobility. Now, some insights and thoughts on inclusion. The issue of inclusion in education and training has been addressed for several decades at both European and national levels. Together with equity and access and educational success, inclusion is a basic principle of education and training, but achieving this is still a challenge for EU education and training systems, with significant differences between and within member states. More than ever, including in the wake of COVID-19, it is crucial to ensure inclusive, high-quality education and training, and to make it available and accessible to all learners, regardless of their gender, their socioeconomic, migrant, ethnic, religious, or cultural background, their educational needs, their social orientation on other personal context. Furthermore, particular attention must be paid to learners facing additional or overlapping challenges, such as those with special education needs, or those who have a disability, those going through difficult personal circumstances, from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, with migrant backgrounds, or from minorities, those from economically depressed regions, or from isolated or remote areas. As some you may know, and as our dear Jürgen said, one of the main priorities of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union for education and training has been inclusion, namely equity in access, inclusion, and educational success for all. Those issues were examined in a policy debate in the February Education Council and within a specific conference held by the Portuguese presidency on the topic in April. Furthermore, the Council adopted last May conclusion on equity and inclusion in education and training in order to promote educational success for all. Allow me also then to highlight some key issues from those conclusions. First, socioeconomic background still largely determines educational success in the EU. While efforts have been made to improve equal access in education, attention to individual circumstances and needs is still needed to move towards inclusive education and training system. Secondly, education and training systems must address the existing and growing diversity of European society so that each learner enjoys not only formal but also effective equal access to quality education and training. Third, as inclusion is currently one of the main priorities at the European level, this offers an opportunity to pay more attention to it, including within and through European instruments and funding programs, such as the new Erasmus Plus program, which contemplates now dedicated inclusion measures and provides overarching measures to improve access to mobility opportunities namely for underrepresented groups. Moving on to my third point of today, mobility. Mobility, specifically learning mobility, has been addressed also for many decades within the EU. First of all, within specific programs such as Erasmus, EU flagship and the most popular, well-recognized and successful program in Europe, which was established 35 years ago as a program for the mobility of students from higher education. Over the years, Erasmus mobility has proved to have extremely positive impacts on educational, social, personal, and professional developments for learners and also educators. The new Erasmus Plus program nearly doubling the funding compared to its predecessor's program, and 70% of its budget will support mobility opportunities for all within a lifelong learning perspective. In that sense, we can say that the mobility of learners and staff is the flagship activity within Erasmus Plus. About 10 million individuals, including students, learners, professors, teachers, and trainers in all sectors, are expected to participate in mobility activities abroad between 2021 to 2027. And the new Erasmus Plus brings novelties within learning mobility activities such as blended intensive programs combining online learning and teamwork with short-term physical mobility abroad will be available for higher education. The amount of opportunities offered to vocational training learners for short-term learning mobility and long-term mobility, what we call Erasmus Pro, will be doubled, and those opportunities will be opened up to countries outside Europe. Short-term and long-term learning mobility of school pupils will be now available, offering experiences abroad, both to individuals and entire classes. It should be underlined that I already mentioned previously that the new Erasmus Plus will be much more inclusive, offering broader access to mobility to learners in higher or general education, on vet, adult education, and within non-formal learning. It will facilitate the participation of small-scale and grassroots organizations and people with fewer opportunities, including people with disabilities and migrants, as well as EU citizens living in remote areas. The inclusiveness of the program is also strengthened by the provisions on virtual learning and measures such as language support, preparatory visit, training, and virtual cooperation for people who are unable to participate in learning mobility activities. I will now leave you with some final notes for the discussion that will follow this morning and for the future. Further efforts are definitely needed to establish and put in place measures to help learning mobility become a viable option for all learners, for all students, to make mobility an inclusive opportunity and a reality for all. Member states, EU educational systems, national and regional authorities, education and training providers and institutions, as well educators and learners and students representative organizations or associations have to work in close cooperation, and interoperability between institutions needs to be fostered. European instruments to establish a true inclusive learning mobility in Europe are already there. I have presented some of them today. Now, it is up to all of you, to all of us, to use them and put them in action. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Costa, for highlighting also the importance of a continued joint effort for inclusion in education and in particular student mobility. I will then now give the floor to Vicky Reifling, who will present us more on student mobility experiences, the situation for underrepresented groups and barriers, and possible initiatives that could increase access for these students. Vicky, can I hand the floor to you?
Yes, just can you make me co-host so I can share the screen, please?
Oh.
It's not possible yet. Nope.
If all is correct, you will be able to share now. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, hope. Can you see the presentation? Just yes. Okay. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Vicky Reifling. I'm the coordinator for equality for ESU, and I will present you this. So I have a bit of problem with my screens. Okay. So here's a little overview of the presentation. The images you see here are from publications that are referenced in the presentation, and the presentation will also be made available to you after. And as I have very limited time, oh, I think there's something coming into the screen. Sorry for that. I would just continue. So first, it's the commitment from the Commission, which can be found in the principles and guidelines in the Rome Communique, whereas student mobility should foster diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also specifically increase the participation of students and staff for vulnerable, disadvantaged, and underrepresented backgrounds. And that also translates into the Erasmus Plus program, whereas inclusion is a key priority for the next 6 years, and also that learning mobility is a key tool for to support upward mobility. But why actually do we want to encourage students to partake in student mobility? Well, because of the positive impact it has for the student themselves, but also for society. To name a few, it improves employability. So 23% of past Erasmus mobility participants are less likely to be unemployed 5 years after their graduation. It also improves skills and competences, personal and social development, and also sense of belonging to the EU and readiness to live in a foreign country. I already mentioned vulnerable, underrepresented, and disadvantaged students, but actually, who are we talking about? If we look at these students groups who participate in mobility programs, according to the Erasmus Plus Higher Education Impact Study, 44% have parents without tertiary education. They're often older students, they have minority or refugee background, they come from a short cycle, and also 17% of disadvantaged students have serious health problems and report mental or other disabilities. And if we talk about increasing participations for vulnerable, underrepresented students, we also need to understand barriers that these students are facing that prevents them actually from participating in student mobility. And there, if we combine these two studies, financial obstacles are a huge barrier. And if we look at the CM report, 41% fear loss of income or student job while abroad. Low-income students especially fear the incapacity to cover upfront costs, and also debts, and 2/3 of respondents say that is a huge barrier for them. Other barriers are family reasons and personal relationships, fear of delay in graduation, but also social obstacles like discrimination, which is 4% in the impact study, but in the CM report, it's actually 17% fear discrimination, and 24% of students during mobility periods actually face discrimination. That's even higher for students coming from low socioeconomic background. That is 30%, whereas 16% is based on nationality, 6% on race and ethnicity, and 5% is based on gender discrimination. And other barriers are also finding accommodation, it's the feeling of isolation, and also lack of information. So one barrier that was mentioned was family reason and personal relationships. And in that regard, we need to talk about students with caretaking responsibilities. And often they are underrepresented, and often they are also found in BET and professional higher education. And ESO is part of a project called Inclusive-ER, and we held an international focus group where we also identified that especially students with caretaking responsibilities are very represented. In Finland, it's actually 25%. And other factors that we had for non-traditional students, because the project Inclusive-ER actually aims to increase student engagement for non-traditional students, is that they're often older, they're part-time students, they delay transition into higher education, they work while studying, they have lower economic background, and again, parents without tertiary education. And it's important to note that during the pandemic, actually the caretaking responsibilities increased, which again increased the barrier for these students to participate in student mobility. As mentioned before, a huge barrier is the financial situation. This is from US Student Report 2019, which basically is an initiative that collects data on the social dimension of higher education. And that 25% of students actually say that they have very serious financial difficulties. And also the students who have these difficulties are often, again, older, and they also overlap with our focus group. So they're older, delayed in transition into higher education. Again, parents do not have a tertiary educational backgrounds, parents with financial struggles, and also international students. And here it's also important to notice that a lot of students actually need to have employment along their studies to finance their studies. It's 50% of students would be unable to finance their studies without having a job along. And that again increases the older the students are. So older students must more have a job alongside to finance their studies than, for example, younger students. 70% work to cover accommodation. And again, the necessity to work for students whose parents do not have a tertiary background is higher. So the slides before was before the pandemic. And this graph is taken from a study from ESO that we recently published. And there 65% indicated that they had difficulties paying their overall cost. 70% of students had their income affected due to COVID. And 61% of students have lost their job permanently or temporarily. That is very concerning, because also the study said that especially students who lost their job permanently had incredibly high difficulties covering their study costs and also living costs. Another fear that was mentioned in the studies was the fear that participating in a student mobility basically exceeds or delays the graduation. That's again concerning when we look at the measures in place that prevent students from exceeding their study time, which are financial restrictions. So the impact again underrepresented and vulnerable students the most. And also already before with the financial situation, of course, the pandemic exacerbates these. So the financial burdens for these students is even further increased, and it's a barrier for student mobility. I talked a lot about barriers, but what are possible initiatives actually to increase participation of these students? Well, the first one would be data collection of underrepresented students actually at higher education institutions, but also professional higher education institutions. That is necessary to identify the groups and also to develop adequate support systems. I just mentioned one example that could be introducing liaison officers at higher education institutions that are specifically there for the needs of these students. And also if these support systems are there, of course, incoming students, mobility students could of course profit from them. Another would be data collection of underrepresented mobility students to see if additional support measures are needed. Then internationalization strategies for institutions. And then funding support is incredibly important for underrepresented students. And also when we talk about Erasmus grants, it's important that they are adapted to the living cost of the host country's region. In the same report that was mentioned throughout this presentation, actually 70% of underrepresented students state that in order for them to participate in student mobility, 75% of the cost would need to be covered. And that is not a reality which we have today for most students. Another initiative could be flexible study paths that enable it for students with employment, employment along their studies and caretaking responsibilities to participate in mobility, and also refrain from financial cuts for people who exceed their study time. That could also be a potential initiative to increase student participation in mobility programs. And one very important point I want to make is that even though that online student mobility could seem like let's say, a solution to a lot of these barriers, online student mobility can never replace physical mobility. And we shouldn't replace one with the other, but we should really ensure that physical mobility is accessible for all. And then I will finish off my presentation just by sharing a useful resource a bit for higher education institutions, national agencies, and also ministries of education. And that is this framework, because it actually helps to assess international mobility policies and also practices. And it also helps to advise, like to further improve them, but also to start that process. And then, as I know, there are also some professional higher education institutions and also VET institutions here. I just would like to underline again the Inclusivity project, which just started, but which also aims to create guidelines and tools to have a fully inclusive student engagement for non-traditional students at these institutions. And there we will also include student mobility. So that is all for me. Thank you very much, and I hope I did not go too much over time.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and perfectly in timing, so no problem. Yes, thank you for the very inspiring presentation, which also gives us a lot of food for thought for continuing the conversation. Then now for the second part of this webinar, I would like to hand over to Matteo Vespa to host today's panel conversation.
Thank you very much, Monique. So, good morning to all. We are already halfway through our webinar, so I'm going to introduce our panelists for today. We have Christelle Coed-Annette. She's the Director Advisor of the National Agency for Erasmus+, in charge of cooperation among European Erasmus+ national agencies and the National Inclusion Strategy for Erasmus+. Then we have Abigail Chai, Liaison Officer at the University of Amsterdam, it's International Student Affairs Office, and she deals with inbound and outbound mobility, and also chairs the working groups on inclusion in exchange programs. And then Cam Wai Kai, currently a consultant for internationalization and inclusion in the Service Bureau at the Amsterdam University of the Arts, where he's also the Erasmus coordinator. So we're going to talk about student-centered international mobility and the need to increase representation of underrepresented groups within the international mobility. I will start with a question with Christelle on how France works in identifying underrepresented groups in mobility, and also what are the measures that France does to tackle and to address their needs, and also if while doing this work use specific indicators to measure the progress in inclusion of underrepresented groups within international mobility.
Hello, thank you first for inviting me to this panel. I'm really happy to be there, even if it's virtually. Just a preliminary input, if you don't mind. Well, as you know, one of the main priority of the program is, and it's valid for all sectors, is the inclusion. And the new Erasmus Plus program has been designed with this aim, in fact, to be more inclusive and to reach out people with fewer opportunities. For instance, new actions have been implemented, more flexible, shorter mobilities, blended formats, mixing physical and virtual components, which gives some flexibility to the mobility, and also more resources are also available because the budget has increased, as Janine Costa, it has almost doubled. It has increased by 80%. So with this two factors, we plan to be more inclusive in the program. And in the program guide provided by the European Commission, that defines 8 groups of people with fewer opportunities: people with disabilities, health problem, barrier linked to learning difficulties, cultural differences, economical or social barriers, barrier linked also to discrimination, or for geographical barrier when you live in a remote or rural areas, etc., or small islands, etc., somewhere in Europe. So national agencies had to draw up an inclusion and diversity strategy to best address the needs of these people with less opportunities. Of course, it's adapted to the national context. And in France, we have defined in cooperation with our national authority the public we want to give for mobility purposes a special additional fund as the top-up, financial top-up for some public. So we have defined 7 categories. And only one of these criteria that I will mention right now gives entitlement to the financial supplement under the program. So if you are in one of the situations, you can have some top-up. So it's people from remote areas, and there is a specific classification in France, which is rural revitalization zones. If you are in this category, you can have a top-up. Participants living in a priority district of the city. Also, it's areas of the city with disadvantaged people, with disadvantaged backgrounds, people, students receiving a scholarship based on social criteria, and the lowest levels are eligible also to the financial supplement. Also, we have beneficiary of a college scholarship, because of course our strategy covers all the sectors. Also people in schools, or who are also receiving high school scholarship. So certain categories of them are eligible, and participants also whose family allowance fund quotient is very low, and participants who are registered as a job seeker for more than 1 year, they can have a top-up, and participants who are registered also in some national specific program for inclusion. All these categories have been published, of course, by the Ministry of National Education in France. This is very important. Of course, we would measure the percentage of people from the different categories all during the whole implementation of the program, and we will see how is the evolution, and if we can make during the years, more and more people from the different categories on board in Erasmus Plus program. It's very important for us to make sure that the Erasmus would be the plus for the one who have a bit less opportunities, fewer opportunities. So it's really important for us.
Thank you very much, Krista. Two organizational things. The first one is that for our audience, you have a questions chat where you can also put your questions. So should we have time, we are going to go through them live, but also our speakers will be able to answer them like by writing there. So that. The other one is that for our panelists, we have around 3 to 5 minutes for each intervention, so that we will be able to have time in the end to answer the question from the public, but the timing as for now was perfect. So the second question is to Abigail Shire, because universities are in the first line in reaching out to underrepresented groups, since it's their student body, and so they are fundamental to develop a student-centered approach to mobility. So the question is, what are the policies that are implemented at the University of Amsterdam, and also how to strike a balance on the one hand in the need to target underrepresented groups, and on the other hand, the privacy concerns of creating, let's say, a list of people that are categorized in these categories might create.
Thank you. First of all, I just got a notification that my internet connection is unstable, so my apologies if you noticed that. Yeah, so in terms of identifying needs and best practices regarding underrepresented groups in student mobility, I think that as an international office at the University of Amsterdam, we are very much still in the first stages of setting up an infrastructure in order to be able to do so. And one of the biggest obstacles, like you just said, is privacy laws. Because in order to know where you are moving from and how you can start moving towards equity, you need to understand what the playing field is at this moment. And because we don't really have access to that kind of data, it's really hard to get started. And it causes us to, yes, we can help individuals overcome those barriers, but we are not really able to completely take away barriers and dismantle systems that are causing harms to these groups. So at the University of Amsterdam, there are now diversity officers at every faculty. There's one at the central level, there's one for the services. And we have a couple of associations and platforms that surround certain underrepresented groups. For example, the Student Disability Platform, which works very closely with student services. So what we are currently really doing, we have taken stock of all these different kinds of underrepresented groups. Of course, knowing that there will always be certain blind spots that we as an international office have. And we started up first conversations with representatives of those underrepresented groups. And the next step is to move towards the individuals within those groups and have conversations with them as well to identify those needs and identify the type of barriers that we might not even recognize as such at this time. Another big help for us in identifying needs is we have student ambassadors. So students who have already been part of student mobility programs are asked to join the ambassador program. They get training on certain topics, one of which is, of course, EDI. And then they do a project where they, for example, within the EDI framework, they can pick one of the underrepresented groups and start conversations with them about student mobility. And they usually end that with a webinar, for example, during the EDI festival that we have organized with Birmingham University. So those are some ways that we are currently starting up this entire process. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Now, I have a question for Kwame Kai. So now we go to the Amsterdam University of the Arts, which participated in the pilot project for Erasmus top-up grants. If you could tell us more about the program and your evaluation also of how it has worked in creating, let's say, student-centered international mobility and addressing the needs of underrepresented students.
Okay. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you for the invitation to this panel, and thank you for the presentators. It's very interesting to listen to your presentation. The Amsterdam University of the Arts, we are actually, compared to the Amsterdam University, we are relatively small art education. So I'm the international officer of the AHK, but at the same time, I'm also the Erasmus coordinator, advisor, inclusion, secretary of the steering committee of the diversity and inclusion. There are some pluses to it because I can actually have a lot of contact with either my colleagues or the students. In 2019, our national agency in the Netherlands have invited institutions to join the top-up grant scheme from the Erasmus to give students an extra grant for outgoing mobility, and our institution said yes at that time, and the national agency in the Netherlands have never said okay, you choose. They just let the institution to choose which of the 7 or all 7 underrepresented groups to be included in the scheme. And what the AHK actually at that time decided we just said okay, we just go for all 7 groups. And I will come back to that later, because students, when they talk to me, they always say the first thing is the financial obstacles. But the financial obstacles is only a symptom of the other. So that's why we don't want to exclude that. So how we actually tackle that? First of all, of course, we have to make a policy about that. So I wrote a plan for our board of directors and for the directors of our 6 academies. And they agree that that is a good plan to implement. And then I start to talk to all the stakeholders. So in our case, all the coordinators of internationalization of each academy, and at the same time also the student advisors. Those are the ones who are actually most of the time in our institution the first contact for students who have some sort of challenge. And I also managed to organize some focus groups discussion with alumni. And my plan was also to talk to current students. And then we caught COVID. So we felt like the whole process is a bit stalled, but we sort of we just go with it anyways. And so in the last 2 years, we have a few students who did actually apply for the top-up grant, but it was not for me particularly. I really felt like I couldn't actually go all the way to promote this, because we were not supposed to promote outgoing mobility during the COVID time. So that was a bit of, but at the same time, I've just used the opportunity to actually talk to more stakeholders, and I think one of the things that I've learned, I always tell students I'm actually part of this. I cover 4 of the 7 groups from the represent, and you can talk to me about that, but at the same time, I'm still learning a lot. So I always start the conversation, whether with all the stakeholders, whether it's colleagues or with my students, because my colleagues actually knows a lot. And because we're such a small institution, it's a very customized service. We have a very short lines between the director and the student, between me and the student, and with their artistic directors. So actually, a lot of my colleagues, they know a lot. At the same time, I'm just always inviting them to tell me. It's like we are a learning organization. And can you actually tell me what we can do better to facilitate you? I'm asked the same question to my colleagues, but also to the students, and also to the alumni. And the alumni, the group that I talked to, they are those who decided not to do the Erasmus mobility. For me, it was so good to talk to them, to ask them like, what's the reason for them? And sometimes it's just very small reasons, like they just felt like they were disencouraged during their learn to study for whatever reasons. It could be just like one comment from a teacher, or they have never had any good practices, or they're the first generation of students most of the time. And also from the student from the neurodiverse spectrum, for instance, for them it's a huge challenge. And I see it particularly actually last year, it's like how much we still work need to be done to make actually even the information more accessible to them. So I can go on forever actually, Matteo, but maybe this is a good start, I think.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you very much. And it was really interesting because this leads to our second part of this conversation about about inclusion, also about what are the how can we say the levels of policy making towards this issue. So to Abigail, I would like to ask you also from your experience, what is like the line between what the universities can do and what needs to be done at the national level? And also, I will also take here the issue that, you know, the national level, of course, gives you a framework on which you can work with. We have just seen that also with top-up grant example. And this is also refers, for instance, to what has been asked in the chat about there are national privacy legislations and under which this data collection can be to target underrepresented groups. So what can be done at the university level, and what needs, let's say, the hand of the state, let's say, to be addressed?
Yes. I would actually like to take that line even further back. It's very interesting for me to hear Konwai talk about how his institution, there's very short lines between, an executive board and the international office. For us, it's not really the same. Policies are made outside of our office, and that makes things difficult as well. So for me personally, in my role as a liaison officer in the international office, the national level is so far away that it's pretty hard to say what the line is between that. But because we have enough of an interesting divide within the University of Amsterdam itself, I think. But in terms of data collection, I think that is something ideally that is taken up at the national level, because I think it's something that every institute in the Netherlands is struggling with. And what we are currently doing is we are looking at these underrepresented groups, and we are deciding, okay, what can we do for which underrepresented groups? Because as long as we don't have an idea of what the scope is of certain underrepresented groups, then we aren't really able to appropriately set up policies to really help them in that sense. So I think that is something that would be nice to do on the national level, to think about together with other institutes and other people who are working on this topic. But I also think that it's an issue at large. It's not just an issue within the international office. Every time we talk about equity in our task force, we always say, well, the University of Amsterdam should do something about this, because as long as the policies within our university aren't there, we cannot move on. But of course, like I said, the UvA is also within the framework of the national laws. So that about data collection. Regarding the top up, I also really like what Konwai said about how finances are a huge issue, but they're often a symptom of the problem. Every time we speak to students, they come to us with a small issue. And they say, well, it's just the finances that I'm struggling with. And then you start the conversation and you realize while they are talking that there's so many more issues that are preventing them from going on to the next step. And even more, some students don't identify themselves with student mobility so much that they don't even get to the worries about finances. So I think an even bigger issue that we need to tackle is actually how do you make sure that in the recruitment phase and the information phase and the awareness phase of students, how do we make sure that underrepresented groups see themselves doing something along the lines of student mobility? And the top-up can, in that sense, help students when they are already informed and interested in student mobility, but it doesn't help those students who aren't even aware. And in that sense, I think that the top-up is just, it's not something that's going to change the system. It can help, again, individual students over certain barriers, but it's not going to necessarily reform an entire system that is causing harm. And one of the ways that you could take the top-up a little bit further, in our opinion, is I think for us, there's a certain sense of, I guess, fear that institutes will just give the top-up and then, you know, say, well, we're done, we've done our duty, here's the money, go ahead, do whatever. But it's not a lot. It's a nice little top-up, but it's not going to help you cover your monthly costs. So how do you, what we would like to experiment with is setting up, for example, certain workshops that could help students give actual tools that will help them during their entire process of student mobility, from the first application until they return, and not make that mandatory, of course. We are just going to give the top-up and then give the option of, well, we recommend this program to spend that money on if you so wish, to not just do away with our responsibility after giving the top-up. Yeah, I think I'll conclude with that.
Perfect. Also, it's very important what was mentioned, the importance of the institutions also to follow their students during the mobility from the very beginning to the end. There are, of course, policies to paperless Erasmus, etc. at the European level, but we've seen, for instance, during the pandemic. Also, as student unions, we saw that there were very many difficulties that the students were needed to face. Of course, also the universities, and we also had some times where we need to, let's say, shield the student from the request of university, for instance, to give back the grants or something like this. So it's important also, this important, let's say, institutionally accompany the students in all the processes. I go back to come on this issue of the what's mentioned about the other obstacles. So these nuances, but maybe which are not, of course, only nuances. Can you elaborate further on that? And also, I guess that we are talking in this case about national top-up grants that were given. So, from your experience, Cam, how this system could be bettered in order to increase the chances for students to actually go on Erasmus from underrepresented groups?
Okay. First of all, I actually want to add something to what Abigail said earlier. It's true that the top-up grant, it's just a stack of money. But I felt like when I'm talking to students, especially those alumni, they said like, "Wow, that's a stimulus. It really stimulates us." Like, and some students said like, "Oh, it saves me one of our two side jobs that I need to do." So sometimes we think like that 250 or in 2019 was even lower, where you can get extra per month. That's actually something big for them. So I think don't underestimate that. And at the same time, I think the European Commission did a good job actually to say like, okay, we're going to give you the grant, but you handle it. I think as an institution, we have to think what we're able to facilitate students by. I think we're actually at the process of learning a lot more about our students, about actually everybody. Everybody has some form of neurodiverse spectrum, I think. I always joke about that, but it is true. I mean, in this whole process for the last 18 months, I think I've just become actually even more humble about when you actually talk to people. and gathered the information. So when I'm talking to students, when they actually, I always invite them to talk to me for 15 minutes about like why they think that they need the top-up grant, but I don't need them to show me any like on paper that they show me any evidence. For me, it's like my questions to them is, we are a learning institution as AHK. What is that what we can do for you? And by listening to the story, you already hear which obstacles, which challenges they are facing. I mean, it's up to me to tick the box. They don't have to do it anymore. So I think this is also for the institution, it's actually the best way to gather the information and to give them back. And I always ask students like, okay, after the conversation, I will say like, I will confirm on email that you are entitled to get a grant, but also ask them like, can you actually give me feedback? Do you feel actually safe during the conversation? Is there anything that I can do better? And I think if we can actually give that security, and what is most important, I think that for a lot of institutions is that we're still actually learning the language. The inclusive language is so important. For this student, it's just that the fact that I'm actually know a little bit of that language already actually give them like, okay, you can see that the whole, they just feel a little bit more relaxed, and they're willing to actually tell you, and what they tell you is a lot. And I would invite institution actually go into that. I mean, talk to student is the best. I forgot your question, Matteo.
I think on one part is I think covered on the obstacles. So in the sense of listening to the stories and seeing what are so every story is different, and the importance is to also for data protection measures that the institution has this, let's say, case by case approach that is. So I think that is very valuable. No, it was just a brief comment on the on what could be better for the top-up grants that you applied and you used.
Well, I think what we actually already decide is actually make the procedure as, you know, you don't want to make an extra obstacle for a student to get the grant. So, so it has to have a very low threshold. It has to be welcoming. They have to feel welcomed and invited to do that, and no shame. In the Netherlands, we're not accustomed to self-identify like we are from the GLBTQ plus community, or migrant is also not. We don't want to talk about it. We think when we don't talk about it, we don't discriminate, which is actually not the right, because a lot of the, we don't know actually about a lot of the groups. So we have to just face it and acknowledge that we're still learning. I think that's the language thing is for me still the thing, the information to the students. One conversation I had with someone who deals a lot with students from the neurodiverse spectrum, she said like, how do you actually inform students? I said, well, we put things on the website. And then she's like, oh, a lot of reading, huh? And just the moment that I realized that we have to do a lot of more videos and short, you know, just make it visualize a lot more, and to make it more accessible for students. And I think the most important for us is the nuances actually in our language. It's like for all the underrepresented groups, they can hear from you whether you know about the issues, whether you actually you don't have a judgment about that. You don't feel like you're better than them. You're actually helping them. You pity them. No, if you just feel like you just look at them at the same level, the equity is like I mean, you have the potential. We just need to activate it. So I think that's the most important.
May I comment also on what Cam said? Because of course, the international officer and the university have a very huge role of informing, guidance, supporting the students. But more generally, we have made a study in France, which was called Facilitating Mobility Among Vulnerable Population. And it was broad image on students, but even wider. And also what we call the influencers to give the information, the input about the program. It can be the peers, I mean, people around in the circle of in the student circle, classmates, friends who had made an experience abroad. They have also a major role, as well as teachers, to encourage and giving a first input on the existing opportunities of mobility. And I want also to underline the role of course of the Students Association, and they made a very good job also in analyzing the situation, like Vicky told us. But for instance, also Erasmus Student Network, also they had a project called Inclusion Plus, and they had very interesting results. And the fact to have access to the information and to have a personal support and guidance, and to talk with other people like you. I mean, you can identify to them. It's really, really important. And I would also insist on the fact of also creating events. And I mean, the university and the schools, they do a lot of events to promote and give guidance. And for instance, in France, I mean, and everywhere in Europe, there is the Erasmus Days. Probably you have heard about it, and you are probably maybe part of it. It's every year from the 14th to the 16th of October this year. And we invite all universities to raise awareness about what they do in terms of Erasmus Plus program, what are the results, to encourage also students to be active on the social networks. And we will put this year a special focus on inclusion. So we really invite all the audience to maybe to program or plan events from the 14th to the 16th of October, just to raise awareness to everybody, and especially the underrepresented group, to the power of Erasmus Plus, to change their life, to change their personal development and potential development for finding a job, very good job in the labor market. So.
Thank you, Krista. I was going to ask you actually part of this question on the sense of how the French experience is similar or different to the Dutch one. So I would ask you the second part of my question, which was about the new Erasmus 2021-2027. From your perspective as a national Erasmus agency, and also from what we've heard from this conversation, do you think that how would you evaluate the progress that has been done in terms of policies, let's say in the new Erasmus framework 2021 and 2027? What are the things that might be bettered in the next multi-annual financial framework when from 2028 onwards?
Yeah, well, I think that very large, a very big improvement have been made comparing to the previous program, because we have more budget. We have a very high target of mobile persons. Can you imagine that? I mean, from the start of Erasmus Plus in 1987 till 2017, and we were celebrating the 30 year of Erasmus. We will celebrate the 35th birthday next year, but during this 30 years period, we have sent people 10 million persons abroad. During a framework of just 7 years, we will also plan to send 10 million persons abroad. So there is a very, very big increase of the mobility. What is very, very interesting, that there were plenty also of studies which were carried out by national agency, by students association, by a lot of stakeholders, and they showed concretely what was the advantage of mobility in terms of insertion in the labor market, in terms of personal development, professional development, competencies, and so on. And they show, all of them, that there is a very, very big gap between before mobility and after mobility. And that's why it's very important that everyone, and especially the underrepresented group, can benefit of that. It's there is all the social cohesion behind that. It's very important that everybody is on board and can take advantage of Erasmus Plus opportunity. And I want also to say that while we have inclusion, we have also the question of digitalization of the program, because I mean we are in a more and more digital environment, and we have to change things also. And the question of environment is new also, and it's really, really important. I mean, and all universities and all stakeholders around them, we have a major role also to play, and also to raise awareness and about this. And I think that the new model of European universities also, which are new, will bring some very innovative and very good food for thought and actions for all of European universities. So I think we have a very good perspective, in fact, for the future, and we need them, because I know it's tough also for the students now. The situation is tough, and we need to offer some window to something else, to the future. In a positive way.
Thank you very much, and thank you much for to our panelists. It was very interesting, and I hope it was also for our audience too. Now we head back to Janine for these last remarks of this day.
Many thanks, Matteo. It was indeed very interesting. I think we could stay all together for the morning and also for the afternoon exchanges, thought and ideas, and sharing experiences and practices. I will only make 2 or 3 comments. I will not cover all the exchanges, but only 3 things that shocked me or raised me some issues and questions. And the first one is, yes, indeed, Erasmus Plus is now indeed plus. And in that sense, a plus, because in French is plus, so it's plus more inclusive and much more inclusive than from its predecessor, and it's a very good thing. I have to say, however, because I'm an old lady, and at the end of the 80s, 89, I was in the Ministry of Education and closely working with, at that time, the Erasmus national agencies. And at that time, we also struggled with the issues of the need to provide students from higher education with fewer opportunities, well, a chance to also have a learning mobility abroad. And at that time, I remember that at that time, Commission and the program allowed national agency to give more money to this kind of students, even to pay for a person that could accompany this person. I presently and experience this. So my first is, yes, indeed, Erasmus Plus is now an Erasmus Plus Plus and Erasmus More More. And that's indeed very good. And because I'm also negotiated the regulation of the new Erasmus Plus program, for us, it's indeed a victory. The second comment that I want to make, and I was listening, Abigail, is you have said national level is far away from my institution. And it's indeed a shock to everybody, namely what we can call the political level or the national authorities and the ministry. We can't, and I will repeat, we can't implement the program, the Erasmus program. We can't, yes, promote more learning mobility and a more inclusive mobility if all the stakeholders are not working closer and together. So I know, I understand, because we used to listen many bodies saying we are far away. So it is indeed an issue in which all of us, I'm not talking about only the national authorities, but also all of us, including the institution, but not only the institution, when we mean the institution, but the students, the learners, the national authorities, the regional authorities, and so on, need to tackle and address. Otherwise, the program will not reach the objective to be indeed more inclusive and open to indeed all learners. And I will finish. I've got 2 or 3 more things to say, but we are already delay, and I will now, I think that Jürgen also will make some comments or final comments or comments final. But well, I'm like you, if you are leaving me talking, and many people who knows me know that I can talk about it during one day. So many thanks to you. I hope that we'll be able other time on the future to talk about these issues, those issues that are very, very relevant for all of us. And also for the European Union and the European project.
Thank you very much, Janine. And I will pick up from there. And thank you very much for your reflections on a very rich discussion in the panel. I have a few additional comments, but also showing the richness of what has come up. But let me start by saying that unfortunately that we still see, as stated by Janine, that socioeconomic background is still very much determining educational success. So we need to address growing diversity in our education systems, and inclusion measures are to be addressed. Now, this is true in general, but all of this also applies to learning mobility, which is a flagship of Erasmus. So we need to make more effort to make learning mobility, or even better, physical learning mobility, a viable option for all. And in particular, because of the beneficial effects on individual students, as was pointed out by Christelle. We've seen some important evidence from Eurostudent, from Bologna with Student Eyes, and there is a need for measures. Measures regarding data collection, financial measures, but also things like flexible learning paths. And everybody I think agreed to the fact that online mobility cannot replace physical mobility. So how can we ensure this for all? Now, there is a clear need to distinguish groups, also then be able to use Erasmus Plus as a plus for the underrepresented groups. But I think we've also seen that financial obstacles can tend to be a system of other obstacles. So top-ups are a good start, but maybe not a final solution. And when are top-ups enough? I think it was very clear that when we look at data collection, privacy issues arise. And so this also very much makes this an issue for the national level and not for the institutional level. But what I like from the discussion is that for the institutions, it's key to talk to representatives from underrepresented groups. And I like the notion of the learning organization, inviting students to tell what's needed and to do this in a safe environment. And for one, I've noted to keep high on the agenda to improve access to information and guidance. And as a last note from the discussions, we need to be aware that procedures do not add new obstacles. So once again, a warm thanks to the Portuguese presidency and all the panelists for the very rich discussion. I can tell you that inclusion of student mobility will remain an important theme in the years to come, and which we will continue to commit to. We will share some written reflections afterwards, and this will also appear on our website. And we will make sure that the audience will also receive the slides that were presented during this seminar. So thank you all for your attention to the audience, and thanks to all the contributors to this seminar. And I hope to see you soon all to continue the discussion on this very important topic and make sure that learning mobility gets a viable and real option for all students. Thank you very much.
Bye, many thanks, bye-bye.
You all for contributing.
Thank you very much, and goodbye also to our viewers.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Very much.